Hello, let us see today what is hypothesis. How can we define hypothesis? Which are the different types of hypothesis and how we can test a hypothesis. There are many questions from this area in different years of question papers. In hypothesis, it is made up of two words, hypo and thesis. Hypo means less than. So hypothesis is less than a thesis. It is a presumptive statement or a proposition or a reasonable guess. It is an educational guess. We can state a hypothesis in the form of a statement or in the form of a question. Later on, we are proving this hypothesis with our experiment. In the formulation of hypothesis, the investigator relates one or more variable to make predictions about the relationship. There are many variables in a situation and how these variables are related to each other. That's what the researcher is going to find out. The hypothesis tells the researcher what to do in the context of the problem. In the context of the problem, what to do, in which way we have to proceed in order to get a solution. Example, the researcher is interested to do a study. Why does a gifted child become a poor achiever in his class, in a class test or in a particular exam? Why a gifted child is a poor performer? What all things a researcher can guess? Most probably it may be due to some disease during the exam. For a particular exam, a gifted child is performing very poorly. That means maybe because of the disease, maybe he could not study due to some other circumstances in the family, maybe a loss of a family member or something like that. So a researcher can make a hypothesis, initial hypothesis. What he is making initially, he is making the initial hypothesis thinking that he might be suffering from some disease during the examination. Then later on he can prove that hypothesis right or wrong based on the available data. He can interview the family members, he can interview the child, and he can find out probable causes of his poor performance. This is just a simple example. Now let us see what are the different types of hypothesis. First one is simple hypothesis. Simple hypothesis is a statement made to reflect the exact relationship between two variables. Variable, we can call it as independent variable and dependent variable. Whichever variable we are measuring, on which variable we are finding the effect, that variable is known as the dependent variable. The other variables that affect that particular variable is called independent variable. For example, smoking is a prominent cause of lung cancer. Here, dependent variable is lung cancer. This lung cancer is might be caused by smoking. So, which is the independent variable here? Smoking is an independent variable. This is an example for simple hypothesis. Next one is associative hypothesis. Associative hypothesis predicts an associative relationship between the independent and dependent variable. Here there are two variables, one is independent and one is dependent variable. Here in associative hypothesis, we are explaining an association between these two. For example, when there is a change in one variable, changes also occur in the other variable. For example, employee training program increases the productivity of employees. Which is the independent variable here? We are measuring the productivity of employees. So, independent variable is productivity of the employees and dependent variable is employee training program. So, both the variables are associative here. The next one is empirical hypothesis. Empirical hypothesis is also called working hypothesis. It claims a theory's validation via experiments and observation. Through experiments and observation, we are validating a theory. That is known as an empirical hypothesis. This way, the statement appears justifiable and different from a wild guess. So, through just experiments and observation, the statement appears that it is more justifiable. It is not a wild guess. Example, women who take iron pills face lesser risk of anemia than those who did not. Here, researcher is not simply stating a hypothesis. Here, researcher make the statement after assessing a group of women who is taking iron pills. Next is statistical hypothesis. This is a type of hypothesis that already exists. Maybe someone must have done experiment on that particular hypothesis years back, and that time it was proved right. Maybe after a few years, what is the condition? That's what the researcher is trying to find out. For example, hypothesis like 44% of Indian population belong to the age group of 22 to 27. So now the researcher is going to find out that it is right or not, it is correct or not. Now what is the condition? So that type of hypothesis is called statistical hypothesis. Next is null hypothesis. A null hypothesis proposes that there is no relationship between two variables. So it is a negative sentence. It is denoted by H0. It is a negative statement like attending physiotherapy session doesn't affect athletes on field performance. Here the researcher claimed that physiotherapy session have no effect on the field performance even if there is any effect. But what is null hypothesis says here? There is no effect of physiotherapy on field performance. That type of hypothesis is called null hypothesis. Null hypothesis is the only hypothesis we can test through statistical way. Next is alternative hypothesis. It is considered to be the opposite of null hypothesis. Alternative hypothesis is denoted by H1 or HA. It implicitly states that dependent variable affects the independent variable. It is not a negative sentence, it is just an opposite of null hypothesis. How can we say this same null hypothesis in an opposite way? For example, attending physiotherapy session improves athletes in field performance. That we are saying it in a positive way. So this is called alternative hypothesis. If we check this alternative hypothesis closely, we can again divide this alternative hypothesis into two heads, which are the directional and non-directional. Directional means there the relationship we will say it is in a positive way or negative way. But in the case of non-directional hypothesis, the effect we are not specifying in which way it is increasing or decreasing. That way we are not specifying in the case of non-directional. For example, hypothesis that state the result would be either positive or negative are called directional hypothesis, and it is denoted by H1 less than or H1 greater than. That way we are denoting it. The sign is H1 less than or H1 greater than. Non-directional hypothesis only claim an effect on the dependent variable, that it does not clarify whether the result would be positive or negative. It is affecting in the positive or negative way, we are not specifying. Now let us see how can we test a hypothesis. There are many steps in order to test a hypothesis. First step is what? State your null and alternative hypothesis. For example, in the earlier case, we say that physiotherapy does not affect the field performance. That is the null hypothesis. What is the alternative hypothesis? That is the physiotherapy affects the field performance. That is the alternative hypothesis. That way we are stating the null and alternative hypothesis. That is the first step. In the second step, we are collecting the data systematically using different data collection technique. For example, in the previous example, we can collect the data or the performance of students, those who are undergoing physiotherapy, how they are performing in the field, and those who are not undergoing physiotherapy, how they are performing in the field. In different age group, we can conduct the experiment, or we can collect the data from different age group. What is the third step? We are performing the statistical test. In order to analyze the data properly, we will do the statistical test. Then, in the fourth step, we decide whether we should reject the null hypothesis or we have to accept it, and so that we have to reject our alternative hypothesis. That is the fourth step. Then fifth step, we are presenting the findings to the audience, or for the subject we are presenting our findings. These are the different steps in the case of hypothesis testing. In the next slide, let us see with an example how we test a hypothesis. For example, the researcher wanted to test there is any relationship between the gender and height. Based on the knowledge of human physiology, a researcher can formulate the hypothesis in such a way that men are on an average taller than women. It is the initial hypothesis. To test this hypothesis, we restate it as null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis. What is the null hypothesis in this example? Men are on an average not taller than women, because null hypothesis we always state in the negative form. Then what is the alternative hypothesis here? Men are on an average taller than women. Then, for a statistical test to be valid, it is important to perform the sampling and collect data systematically. If your data is not representative, you cannot make the statistical inferences about the population. We cannot collect few men from only one area and few women from one particular country or from one part of the country. We cannot do that. Our sample should be the representative of the entire population. For example, we have to then finalize the scope of our study. Maybe we are doing this particular study in only one country. In that case, from different state we have to collect the sample, and women and men, the number of women and men we are collecting should be equal. So that way your sample should have an equal proportion of men and women, cover variety of social economic classes. From different socio-economic classes we have to collect the sample. So we have to collect the sample in a systematic way. In this case, maybe the census data we can use as a potential data source. The next step, we are performing the statistical test. Which way we are doing the statistical test? Usually all the statistical test is based on one peculiar property, like what is the variance within the group, or what is the variance in between the group. So here, which are the two groups? Group of women and group of men. Here we are finding out the average height first, then from each woman how from the average height differing their height. So the variance is difference from the mean average value. So that way we are finding out in each group, and then later on we find out the variance within the group. That means within the group of women, and in between the group, what is the variance between group of women and what is the variance between the men. That way we are finding out the variance between the group and within the group. Then we are calculating the p-value from this data. What is p-value actually? P-value is the ratio between the variance of between the group divided by within the group. That whenever we are calculating the p-value, we are comparing this p-value with the table p-value. There is a table available ready-made. From that we have to find out the p-value. When our p-value is smaller than the table p-value, we can reject the null hypothesis and we can accept our alternative hypothesis. This is the way we are doing the statistical test. So in the next test, we reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis based on the value of p we are getting. Then later on we will present the findings for the audience. These are the different steps of hypothesis testing.